10 seconds.
Okay. Oh, 10 seconds starting. All right. So do I have to do anything? Oh. We're good. Okay. So good morning, folks. Give us another minute or two. Let us fill up here. I see some of my students coming in. Okay, we'll start in about 2 minutes. All right, why don't we go and get started? Good morning, I'm Bill Rodgers from Rutgers University, and I will be chairing this morning's panel titled Minimum Wages, Self-Employment, and Job Vacancies. As we were chatting in the kind of some quote unquote green room, I was telling folks that this is actually a nice break from my work on COVID-19. So hopefully we can extend it for a bit longer. I'm sure many of you feel the same way. We've got, I think, a really fun panel. We've got 3 papers, and the way we're going to, I think, run or the conversation will be Ben Glasner will present first, minimum wage, self-employment, and the online gig economy, and then Didem Tuzemen from the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City will present their work, a co-authored piece on minimum wage increases and vacancies. And then Dillan, Francesca, Bono-Lunn from Elon University will present a co-authored paper on state minimum wage increases and self-employment, analysis of heterogeneous treatment effects across occupations. For one, myself, who's done some work on minimum wages, what I like about these 3 pieces is that they go beyond looking at employment effects. They go beyond looking at simple employment effects. Either thinking about different ways of trying to identify whether or not there's an impact of the minimum wage, and how, if so, how much, and how big, and then also sort of beginning to really think more in a richer sense of how minimum wage increases, particularly at the state level, can ripple through the economy. So that's my kind of a quick preview. We, as I said, we're going to present in the order as listed in the program. So that's the Glasner piece will go first. What we'll do is all 3 papers will present, and then that's about 20-25 minutes a piece. After that, we'll then go into kind of a roundtable discussion. Hopefully I will not have to throw out some prods or some questions or comments, that they'll be organic, that Ben, Dillan, and Didem, and Jeremy, and actually Murat, all the panelists who are here, we'll kind of take it off into a conversation for about 20-25 minutes, and then the remaining time we'll push it to the audience, and I'll ask that you use the Q&A. That we'll use the Q&A or the chat function if you to pose your questions, and I'll relay them or read them, and then we'll get answers from our speakers. So why don't we start? Ben, you want to load your slides, and away we go.
Absolutely. Well, good morning, everyone. I really appreciate being able to have the chance to come and talk about this paper and just get a sense on either some feedback or where it goes. I'm also really excited to hear the other papers in this. So it's a great session. My paper is titled The Minimum Wage, Self-Employment, and the Online Gig Economy. I'm Ben Glasner, and I'm coming from the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington. So I just want to start off immediately by addressing what are the research questions I'm going to try and work through with this paper. And they begin with just asking the simple question of, do minimum wage increases impact the exempt labor market, or types of work that don't actually truly exist within minimum wage literature? So this can range from independent contracting, traditional self-employment, spot market work. Just how do minimum wage policies impact these other people or other types of work? I then want to go further and start thinking about, does this effect vary by the concentration of local labor markets? So get a little bit into the monopsony versus oligopoly versus competitive minimum wage literature, and think about how, if there is an effect on self-employment, does it vary by local labor market competitiveness? And then add in the fact that we are now seeing the extension and expansion of online gig work and the platform economy, and how might that interact with any observed effect of the minimum wage? So when we're thinking about minimum wage policies, I think everyone of the panelists here is pretty familiar, but just in case the audience wants to kind of review some of it, we know that there's a lot of division on how it's viewed, a lot of uncertainty and heterogeneity in results. A lot of people can disagree, and you can start a fight pretty quickly in an economist-filled room over minimum wage results. So when we think about what they actually do, I want to start by addressing the fact that they make a non-exempt and an exempt marketplace as they've been written in the United States and from the Fair Labor Standards Act. So we know that some types of work do get applied minimum wages and some don't, and that's changed over time by both sectors and types of work. So we want to think about, how does the line being drawn as some types of work get a minimum wage and some don't, and how that line being drawn might impact labor dynamics between the two marketplaces. We also know that there's systemic differences in policies across these lines. So it isn't just minimum wages that affect the non-exempt work and don't affect the exempt work, but we know that other policies also impact it. Things like health insurance supplied by employers, as well as other aspects. Unemployment insurance traditionally until the CARES Act, retirement supports. So we want to think about how it's not just looking at one line of policy, but this actually interacts with quite a few, and what we might be able to learn about that division between the marketplaces by exploring this one example. So given that there's mixed findings across numerous different outcomes in minimum wage literatures, I think it's really nice that we have 3 papers here talking about the same type of effect and using different methods and different data sources for it. So I'm excited to kind of see how that develops in the conversation after. And we know that we found both null effects on employment and heterogeneous effects across individual workers and labor market competitiveness more recently, as we've been looking at new literature that's been addressing the fact that we are starting to see, through better methods, that the effects of minimum wages do vary across labor market competitiveness and concentration. So I'm going to hope to kind of add to that growing literature on the subject. So why do we really care about self-employment if it gets affected by minimum wage? Well, I want to think about it from a couple dimensions. First, the Fight for 15's impact on local and state minimum wages has grown since it started kind of pushing forward. And we've been seeing that momentum growing as well, both at the federal and other state levels. We've also seen a development and an expansion in gig work as a supplemental source of income. So we want to think about the fact that it's not just that this work might be growing in popularity, but that the fundamental dynamics of that work have changed as well. So thinking about how policies that we built 70, 80 years ago might relate to a new style of work, and if it has different types of impacts on that type of work. And the only way we know is by testing it. There's also been that introduction of local and state policies governing online gig work and trying to combat misclassification. So if we're thinking about new steps that local and state governments can try and do to kind of wrangle in the online gig economy and understand how it interacts with our broader policy environment, we really need to start figuring out, well, what are the current policies doing to this type of work? And once we know what they're doing right now, then we might be able to make a better guess on how we actually can get to policy goals from there. And there's new types of social supports for the self-employed and independent contractors. The CARES Act and pandemic unemployment assistance is one of the biggest steps in policy for UI into this world. We can see that policy has the ability of moving into self-employment that previously we've seen quite a bit of hesitance in interacting with. So thinking about the ways that previous policies and new policies are interacting with this traditionally exempt space, I think is very important moving forward as we start addressing what independent contracting really should mean in the US. So I'm going to introduce a theoretical background for the purposes of the competitive versus oligopsonistic markets and kind of walk through what I think we might be able to expect when we're thinking about the impact on an exempt marketplace. So if we're working in a competitive market, traditionally, we might expect negative effects on the extensive and intensive margin of employment in the non-exempt marketplace. So we might expect that in a marketplace with a lot of buyers and sellers of labor, we would imagine that as minimum wages are introduced, that some people might lose jobs or get a cutback in hours. We can see this kind of traditional Econ 101 idea of the minimum wage, and some of those negatively affected might transition into a marketplace that doesn't have a minimum wage applied to it. If that's the case, the decision of how large that transition into the exempt marketplace will probably depend on the barriers to exit and entry between the two markets, as well as the size of the negative effect on employment there. At the same time, in an oligopsonistic marketplace or a monopsonistic one, where we have a few buyers of labor, there might be no effects or positive effects on the extensive and intensive margin of employment in the non-exempt marketplace as the wage rate increases in the non-exempt market. This might incentivize some people to transition into the non-exempt marketplace due to an increased return to work. And income and substitution effects may lead to uncertain results in this case, as workers might decide, maybe I'm going to put more of my labor into the non-exempt marketplace, or since I've gotten more returns to the non-exempt work, I no longer need to work as much. We can imagine this visually by saying if we look at a non-exempt marketplace on the left, and there's some minimum wage instituted creating a loss in labor, we can think about this as either hours or actual lost jobs, then some share of that labor, alpha, theta, might move into the exempt marketplace on the right, and we might see a reduced return to work there, as well as a shift in the number of workers, whether that's classified as hours put into the exempt marketplace or the actual number of workers who might declare that type of income. What I'm going to really focus on is looking at that shift from Q star exempt work to Q prime exempt work. Thinking about, can we look at, is there an actual movement along that axis for more self-employed, or are we going to see some other shift? To do this, I'm going to use non-employer statistics, which are the count of non-employer establishments and total receipts taken in at the county industry year level. A non-employer establishment has no paid employees, annual business receipts of $1,000 or more, and is subject to federal income taxes. What this data really collects are just the number of unincorporated self-employed, including independent contractors, in a particular geographic area in a year. And this is coming from tax data, so it's administrative. And these workers are all exempt from minimum wage. And the date that I'm going to be using is ranging from 2000 to 2018. I'm also going to be using county business patterns to get the count of employer establishments at the county industry year level. I'm going to use this to construct a measure of local labor market concentration via the HHI. So this is just to try and get a sense on how many employers are there in a given county in a given year, and of those number of employers, what concentration of the labor market does each one possess as a general average. So this should give me a sense on how many potential buyers of non-exempt work are there relative to the number of people in that marketplace. I'm also going to use minimum wages coded at the county level, and this is going to be inclusive of federal, state, and local minimum wages, and it's defined as the highest minimum wage active in a county on January 1st of that year. This is also going to be using local minimum wages that might be at a sub-county level. So if a metropolitan area has a higher minimum wage than any other metro in the county, that county will be defined by that highest minimum wage in the metro area. So this is meant to combat a little bit of that movement into work. This is something that, coming from Seattle and University of Washington, we're very sensitive to the idea of metropolitan minimum wage changes. So I wanted to figure out a way to try and adjust for those minimum wage changes at the local level as well as at the state. I'm also going to use data on the development of the online gig economy, and I'm going to be measuring this by using the geographic and time varying rollout of Uber within the US. So the whole goal here is still to just look at different variations on the exempt marketplace. And since the online gig economy is one of the most prominent new age things on independent contracting, I want to use Uber as kind of an indicator for the expansion over time and space in where Uber's deploying and how it's impacting independent contracting work. And it's coded for the treatment of Uber at the core-based statistical area level. So for metropolitan areas that might be linked geographically through a lot of transition into work, they're also going to be treated by Uber if the metro area gets treated by Uber. This is to try and control for movement into to areas to drive, because since this data isn't at the where I work level, it's at the where I declare my taxes level. So if I drive to go drive Uber in New York City, but I'm actually from Poughkeepsie, I want to be linked to New York City's Uber development. I'm also going to use county labor force information coming from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, local area unemployment statistics, so I can get a sense on differing sizes of the labor market or in different counties. Since fundamentally the data is at the county level, I need to be able to weight some counties more than others, because LA is probably going to have more of an influence on the aggregate effect than a smaller equivalent county. To do this, with all this data, I'm going to start off by defining two primary dependent variables. First being the number of non-employer establishments per labor market participant in a county in a given NAICS industry. So this is going to be looking at kind of the share of non-employer establishments per labor market and trying to get a sense on what's the likelihood that for any given individual, they might take up one non-employer establishment as a source of income. I'm also going to look at average receipts of non-employer establishments in a county in a given NAICS industry. So one of the reasons why I'm focusing so much on non-employer establishments as my source of data is because it's just collecting tax data. It's not relying on surveys where we primarily ask, what is your primary source of income? So if I use this as a supplemental source of income or just a tertiary or a secondary, I'll still get collected as long as it's above 1,000 receipts. So ECIT isn't necessarily going to be one job for one person. One person could possess 2 or 3 potential non-employer establishments here. So we don't want to view it as a pure probability of interaction. And average receipts is still going to be divided amongst industry level non-employer establishments. I'm also going to use my HHI to calculate and adjust for local labor market concentration. And this is using the CBP. And I'm going to assume each establishment has a minimum number of employees in their firm size category and square the market share of employment in each firm and then sum the resulting shares. And this will give me a quantile measure of HHI, and that's heavily correlated with labor market size. So to be clear, the HHI is going to range in the way that I've defined it from 0 to 10,000, but I'm going to actually use the quantile of HHI to use for my measure of labor market concentration. This is because it's quite tailed, and so simplifying it so it's simply a quantile where 1 is going to be a highly unconcentrated marketplace. So think a large urban metro center, and 100, the larger the quantile, the more concentration there is. And a high concentration would be equivalent or indicative of a low competitive marketplace, so more monopsonistic. So just to look at the data really fast, we can see that with non-employer statistics, we see something we don't actually see in a lot of the survey data, which is a consistent increase in uptake of non-employer establishments over the period from 2000 to 2018. And in particular, when we look at something like transportation and warehousing, we do capture that perceived rise in alternative work arrangements since the advancement of the online gig economy. So on the left, we can see that kind of large rise, but on the right, we see that really substantial increase since about 2013. You also want to note the fact that on the left, we're looking at 0.12 to 0.16, but on the right, we're looking at a substantially smaller dependent variable, smaller dependent variable on the y-axis, implying that transportation warehousing, while everyone talks about it, it's still a much smaller share of independent contracting than the primary dominant thing that it takes up in the media. So while we might use transportation warehousing for this paper, or I might use transportation warehousing for this paper to be indicative of the effect of the online gig economy, it is not dominating exempt work. I want to think about how that relationship might develop over time, but isn't there quite yet. So what I'm going to be identifying on for my method is variation in local and state minimum wages over time across counties, and then interact that with different things for heterogeneity analysis. But the primary methods I'm going to be using are two-way fixed effect models. And we know that there's been quite a few critiques of those recently, and we're going to talk about that. And to address it, I'm also going to be using a couple of different methods of addressing those issues for negative weights or failing to align with event study analyses or thinking about how parallel trends might be violated. So I'm going to use 5 methods in total and talk through how they might be better or worse. I'm going to have all of the methodological details of that included in this PDF, but for the purposes of kind of getting to the meat of the paper, I'm going to talk about kind of these results and how they interact next. So this is the title number 1 big aggregate effect estimates. We can see on the top, for the first two rows, are two-way fixed effect models. For the real minimum wage being the treatment, so this is the inflation-adjusted minimum wage variation over time and space between counties and across years. I also have the unadjusted minimum wage just below it, and I see no significant effect between either my pre-2007, pre-large federal minimum wage increases, the full sample, or the post-minimum wage increase periods at the federal level. And that's that first row, we see no substantial effect. The row underneath, where I'm not adjusting the minimum wage to inflation, I also see no significant effect in any of these periods. The reason why I include the unadjusted minimum wage as a potential thing to compare, because when I'm using the DIDM method, so this is to help kind of condition against negative weighting in the two-way fixed effects, I find that in the pre-period, I see no effect. In the full sample, I do find a significant effect at the 90% time. And then in the post period, so post 2009, and this is the period where we start to see the expansion and development of the online gig economy and platform work and a growing use of independent contracting, we do find a significant effect that is positive. So this 0.0029 and the DIDM post 2009 period is showing us that as minimum wages increase, we do find significant increases in take-up of exempt work. So when we think about this, and I need to use the unadjusted minimum wage here because it's doing a two-period comparison, and that two-period comparison needs consistent levels to compare against. So by adjusting for inflation, you never actually get a consistent control group. So this is just an element of trying to make it comparable to figure out which counties to compare to which. We do find that there is a significant positive effect for the unadjusted minimum wage on take-up of exempt work per member of the labor force. I also use the Callaway and Santana method for group time average treatment on the treated effects, and find that in that post period, I see a very similar result with a different method, which is the 0.0021. And that's in that first year of treatment. I then also look at local minimum wage changes, excluding state minimum wage changes. So this is when I'm just changing my dependent variable from minimum wages across state and local levels to a binary indicator of whether or not a local minimum wage gets introduced. And in these cases, for a slightly different treatment and different method for generalized synthetic control, I also find a positive significant effect across the full sample, but local minimum wage changes in my sample almost all happen post 2009 and in urban areas. And for my synthetic difference in difference, I also find a very similar treatment effect. So what I end up looking at is, while my two-way fixed effect seems to have some issues with negative weights and kind of failing to fully estimate the model, once I start accounting for those issues of parallel trends, failure to comply with event studies, and negative weighting structures, I do end up capturing that positive significant effect, and that effect is almost entirely driven in the post-2009 period, which we start associating with that expansion in the online gig economy and independent contracting platforms. When I look at the average treatment effects on average receipts, though, I find across almost all of my samples, or almost all of my methods, and in each of the sample periods, whether it's pre, full, or post, no significant effects except for one of the 90th percentile for my synthetic difference in difference. So I started looking at this and I started thinking, well, we are seeing a positive increase in the number of people taking up this work, but no real significant decrease on the type of, or the amount of earnings or receipts taken in by these non-employer establishments. And so there's probably something to start looking at there. I also noticed that from the pre-2000 period, I see a consistent negative coefficient that then transitions into a positive one in the post-2009. So between the changing effect on the number of establishments per labor force participant, as well as the changing sign in average receipts, we have a pretty convincing story, in my opinion, that the dynamic in the relationship between the minimum wage and exempt work is changing over the last 20 years. And this aligns with kind of the associated feelings and notion that work has changed in this marketplace, and how we treat self-employment has changed over the last 20 years. We want to think about how policy might be interacting with that changing type of work. So in summary, while I find my two-way fixed effect approach underestimates the effect on both the number of non-employer establishments per member of the labor force and the average receipts of those establishments, using methods that kind of advance away from some of the critiques of two-way fixed effects ends up showing that effect more clearly and pretty consistently across all of those different methods. The post-2009 period also has the large positive effect estimates on the number of non-employer establishments per member of the labor force. So this period where we're seeing the extension of the online gig economy seems more significant, and the average treatment effect on the number of non-employer establishments per member of the labor force for a dollar increase is 0.029, which is about a 1.96% increase in the stock of non-employer establishments. One concern is looking at parallel trends, and I find no real evidence of violation in parallel trends of this effect. So no real worries that before minimum wages increase happened, that there's actually just capturing a different shift in it. And when I start thinking about how this effect might break out across time and space for labor market concentration, I have to address the fact that there's limitations for some of these new methods of dealing with two-way fixed effects, which is primarily that I can't use interaction effects. So what I end up doing is to look at the effect by oligopsonistic or competitive marketplaces. I use subsample analysis based on which quantile subset I'm looking at. And I also readdress with a two-way fixed effect for the Uber interaction that I'm going to use later. So first and foremost, addressing the effect of the minimum wage across labor market concentration. So the bottom quartile here is a very unconcentrated marketplace. So a highly competitive marketplace is the bottom quartile. Oligopsonistic one is a top quartile. So looking at this, I can see that the area that is driving this positive effect are bottom quartile counties. So these are our larger urban competitive marketplaces, are the ones that are driving the positive effect. And I'm seeing no effect to a negative and significant effect as I go to less competitive marketplaces. As I start looking at average receipts, I can see that for no effect is significant across the entire marketplace in any of the periods in any of the years. So this tells me that realistically, what I'm looking at is today, the positive effect is driven by competitive marketplaces that are more urban. And this supports the idea that we're seeing heterogeneous effects of policy across different labor market competitiveness areas. I also want to look at what happens when I think about transportation warehousing for the extension and expansion of the online gig economy. So I've walked through 4 models of my two-way fixed effect approach, but we really want to focus on model number 4, where we look at the change of the minimum wage as well as an interaction effect on the minimum wage and Uber being active, the minimum wage and HHI quantile, and minimum wage and HHI quantile and Uber being active. And what I can see here is that the minimum wage in aggregate has a small negative effect on participation in exempt work for transportation warehousing. But once I introduce Uber, an online gig marketplace with really low barriers to exit and entry, that effect is substantially more positive. And it drives this big positive effect. And that effect diminishes as I go into less competitive marketplaces or more concentrated marketplaces as I go. So what we're looking at is an environment where minimum wage increases lead to positive effects on engagement in exempt work in low concentration counties. And when the online gig economy is there, a low barrier marketplace that's easy to enter and exit, we end up seeing that effect substantially larger, and it really drives that effect. So in summary, low labor market concentration environments, there's a positive effect on the number of non-employer establishments, a null effect on average receipts, and Uber being active really drives a substantial more positive effect among transportation warehousing services. We can imagine that if this type of model of gig work extends into other types of non-employer establishments and other types of exempt work, that effect of the minimum wage would only grow as we end up seeing these exempt marketplaces become easier to enter and exit. High labor market concentration environments or oligopsonistic or less competitive marketplaces, I end up finding null effects on the number of non-employer establishments and average receipts, a decrease in transportation warehousing non-employer establishments when Uber is active, and a decrease in the average receipts of transportation warehousing services. So what this ends up looking like is in environments where there's actually an oligopsonistic market potentially, people substitute their work away from exempt work when the rate of returns to work in non-exempt environments ends up increasing. So we end up seeing confirmation of these two models to a degree in the exempt marketplace that maybe have been more difficult to identify in the non-exempt marketplace. To try and get an estimate of the aggregate effects, I end up looking at what might have happened if there was a $15 minimum wage in 2018. And I find that given that there's variation in different local and state minimum wages at the time in 2018, we can see different size effects. And since urban areas ended up seeing generally a greater likelihood of having higher minimum wages given the Fight for 15's extension, I estimate that with a $15 minimum wage, there would have been about just under 3 million additional non-employer establishments as a result of this. And that would have been about 11.7% increase relative to the stock of non-employers in 2018. To be clear, though, this doesn't mean that 3 million additional full-time self-employed, but simply people taking up at least $1,000 in receipts of non-employer income. These results indicate that minimum wage induces individuals to take up exempt work. The minimum wage has differing effects across labor market concentration. The presence of a low barrier exempt labor market, indicated by the presence of Uber, is responsible for the majority of the effect among transportation and warehousing services, and this it might generalize to other marketplaces. And analysis of minimum wage policies, particularly within less concentrated cities, so large urban environments, need to account for differences between exempt and non-exempt work, independent variables in analysis, but they might, and the potential for transition between the two markets. Thank you. And if you have any questions or thoughts beyond this conference, feel free to reach out at either my email or my website.
Ben, thank you so much. Thank you. Very well presented. We'll now move to Didem, Tuzemen. And she's going to talk about minimum wage increases and vacancies.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. First of all, thank you so much to the organizers for including our paper in this session. Today, I'm going to talk about minimum wage increases and vacancies. This is joint work with Marianna Kudlyak and Murat. And the usual disclaimer applies. These are our views, not the views of the Cleveland Fed, San Francisco Fed, Kansas City Fed, or the Federal Reserve System. All right, let me start with a little overview of the literature on minimum wage increases, which is mostly focused on the employment effects. So when we think about the theory, there is ambiguous results. And it's not just about the magnitude, but about the broader question of, will there be a decline in employment when there's minimum wage increases? When you think about a neoclassical model, a higher minimum wage will lead to a decline in the quantity of labor demand. That is easy. However, that might not be the case if the labor demand for the minimum wage job is inelastic. You can think about a frictional labor market. An increase in the minimum wage will make it more costly for the firm to hire a worker. But when you think about the worker side, the gap between the expected returns to employment relative to unemployment will be increasing. That will mean two things. When there's an increase in the minimum wage, you can expect to see more unemployed individuals search for jobs, and also they might have a higher search effort. And that might lead to easier hiring for firms, as well as a better work for much quality. So although the cost is increasing from the firm side, at the equilibrium, job creation does not necessarily need to be adversely affected. Now, when we move to the empirical literature, there are, of course, a lot more papers. I'm just citing a few here. We continue to see differing results. There are papers that argue that there can be some declines in employment of the potential vulnerable groups when there's increase in minimum wages. Then there are others who do not find such results. And these vulnerable groups that have been considered in the literature are like teen employment in specific sectors, low wage earners, and more recently, those workers in the routine jobs. So overall, the literature has differing results on the effects of minimum wage increases on employment. Now, what do we do in this paper that is hopefully different and contributing to the literature? Now, the first part is on the idea. We're here trying to understand how the firms adjust to changes in the minimum wage hikes. So instead of looking at employment, we're trying to understand things from the firm side, and more specifically, we're looking at the effect of minimum wage increases on the wage posting. And then we're trying to understand the heterogeneity across occupations that will be seen when there's minimum wage hikes. The second contribution is about our identification strategy. So in the papers that I showed you a few slides ago, a lot of the times the difference and difference estimator is used. So this is to compare changes in the employment of these potentially vulnerable groups in the states where the minimum wage increases are more compared to the states where it's less or not at all. And papers in the literature have raised concerns on this approach because this cross-state policy variation can be correlated with some economic shocks that also affect the outcomes. So as an alternative way, we're going to be using triple differences estimator in this paper. And our goal is to isolate the effect of the policy change by comparing groups that are exposed to similar or the same economic shocks, but not the policy change. So more specifically, we're going to use county level vacancy data by two-digit occupations at quartile frequency. And then we're going to estimate the elasticity of vacancies with respect to minimum wage changes. Our identification relies on state level variation in minimum wages, as well as exposure of occupations to minimum wage hikes. What do we mean? Well, not all occupations have a large mass of employed workers at or near the minimum wage. So you can think about workers in the food industries versus management. Therefore, an increase in the binding minimum wage will have different impacts on different occupations, and those who are at risk will be more impacted. Let me go over the results. We are considering the time period 2005 to 2018, and we find that a 10% increase in the binding minimum wage reduces vacancies in at-risk occupations by 2.4%. We find that there's some pullback in vacancy posting, meaning the effect emerges 1 to 2 quarters prior to the change in the policy. And then we look at the robustness of our results using more local controls. And then finally, we find that this negative effect we are finding is more pronounced for manual occupations, whether routine or non-routine. All right, let me start with the data, how we construct our sample for minimum wages. Well, we're going to be doing our analysis at the quartile level. We start with the state level mandated minimum wage and combine this with the federal minimum wage. So what we call the effective minimum wage is basically the maximum of the two. For the period 2005 through 2016, we are heavily relying on the data compiled by the previous study by Beckel and Zipperer. From 2016 through 2018, we're using data from state agencies' websites and information provided by the BLS. Now, I'm gonna show you 3 facts on minimum wage changes in the sample period that we're looking at. So in this chart, we're looking at, on the left-hand side, the dollar amounts that the wages take, and on the right-hand side, the number of states. Now, the blue line corresponds to the binding minimum wage, which is the federal minimum wage. So in 2007, the federal minimum wage starts rising from $5.15 an hour through time up to $7.25 by 2009. And since then, in the sample period, there is no increases. And then the green line is showing the wages, the number of states. For them, the binding minimum wage is the federal minimum wage. And as you can see, since 2009, the number of states who are at the federal minimum wage has been declining. So right now, there are more states that have binding minimum wages, which are higher than the federal minimum wage. Now, the second fact is state level variation has increased over time. So here, the red line is corresponding to the minimum binding wage, which I just showed, which is the federal minimum wage. Whereas the blue line now corresponds to the maximum minimum wage that we see across states. And as you can see, the blue line has been increasing over time, and the gap between blue and the red has increased a lot, especially in the later years of our sample. And then the final fact is there are about 300 effective minimum wage hikes in our sample. the median minimum wage increase is at 7%. Now, this chart is showing the frequency of the minimum wage hikes and the percent increase. And as you can see, a lot of the changes are at 10 or less than 10%, which is a number that we're going to use. Now, how do we determine which occupations are at risk? So the first step is to look at the occupations that have a large mass of employed workers around the prevailing minimum wage. To do this, we're going to look at the current population survey, outgoing rotation groups, and we're going to look at wage distribution by occupation within a state. We're looking at individuals ages 16 and above. We're excluding the self-employed and those working without pay. When available, we're going to use hourly wages. Otherwise, we compute hourly rate using weekly information. And our cutoff is at 110% of the prevailing minimum wage for the reason I just showed in the previous chart, because the minimum wage increases are more concentrated in that area. Okay, so in this table, we're looking at occupations, and we're looking at the fraction of at-risk employment by occupation in each year. So we calculate this at the state level, and then we are averaging across states and across quarters. As you can see, for example, food services, 22% workers would be at risk in this group. Whereas if you look at management and business, you're at around 2%, which is much less. So looking at the means and looking at the different variation in this data, we come up with the second step, and we combine the two to define our at-risk occupations. So these are occupations that at least 5% of the employment share for the occupation earns an hourly rate at or below the 110% of the prevailing minimum wage. And this gives us 6 occupations that are at risk, which are food preparation services, building, grounds cleaning, maintenance, personal care and service occupations, transportation, material moving, office admin support, and sales and related occupations. Now let's move to the vacancy data. Our vacancy data is at the county level and comes from the Conference Board's Help Wanted online data series. We prefer this data series for 2 reasons. First of all, it allows us to have detailed geographical and occupational levels. This is in contrast to the JOLTS data, which again shows vacancies, but we do not have occupation data or not the county level data. Second advantage is we can see the stock of vacancies as well as the flows, which are the new job postings that are less than 30 days old. And again, our sample is at the quarterly frequency between 2005 and 2018. Now, let's move on to the empirical setup. As I said before, we're going to be using a triple difference regression. On the left-hand side, we have vacancies in county I, occupation O, and at time T. Again, this is at the quartile level. We're looking at minimum wage increases in county I at time T, and we're focusing on the at-risk occupations in that county. So what does the beta coefficient tell us? It will tell us the impact of minimum wage increases on the at-risk occupations compared to other occupations in the county, as well as other counties. And the other advantage of using this setup is to be able to use granular level fixed effects. So we have county occupation fixed effects, occupation time fixed effects, and county time fixed effects. Now I'm going to show you first our baseline results using this triple difference regression. And then I'm going to contrast this to the difference in difference regressions that we see a lot in the literature. So that would correspond to the second equation in the bottom line. So what these papers do is they pick the outcomes for the vulnerable groups. Say this is teenage employment or employment in at fast food restaurants, etc. They look at vacancies in county or states, in this case, state I, time T, and then compare minimum wage increases in the states with higher increases versus in the states with lower increases or no increases at all. I'm going to show you that our preferred strategy gives us more reliable results. All right, so this is our baseline triple difference estimates. So we have two panels. On the left panel, we have total vacancies. On the right panel, we have new vacancies. So you can think of the left one as the stock, the right one as the flows. So column 1 shows that when there is a 10% increase in the minimum wage, we see a 2.4% decline in vacancies at-risk occupations. Similarly, for the new vacancies, this is a decline of 2.1%. Now, the second question that comes to mind is, are there any dynamic effects? Meaning, do firms actually change their vacancy decisions prior to what's changing with the policy? Is there an announcement effect? So to understand that, we included the lags and leads in columns 2 and 3. And here we see that actually vacancies decline 1 to 2 quarters prior to the actual policy change. A similar result is shown for the new vacancies. Now let's compare these results with the definitive specification. Okay, now again, I have two panels. On the left, we have the vulnerable group. So these are the vacancies in at-risk occupations. And on the right-hand side, we have other occupations. Now here, this is state level. So everything is aggregated at the state level, and we're looking at the impact of minimum wage increases in total vacancies in at-risk occupations. And as you can see in column 1, we do not find any significant effect. Now, because this is definitive, we can only use county fixed effects or time fixed effects. So remember that in the triple difference, we were able to use county by time fixed effects, which is very important. So in order to understand if that is the real issue with the definitive specification, we thought that we can use the unemployment rate, which will be varying by time by county. So when we add that in columns 2 through 5 in different time periods, we see that, first of all, the beverage curve is there. So there's a negative correlation between unemployment rate and vacancies. But if you look at the coefficient on the minimum wage, you can see that it's in column 2, it's positive, then in column 3, it turns negative and it starts getting larger. A similar thing is true for total vacancies in, this is very different in total vacancies. You see first a positive spurious correlation, and then when you add the unemployment rate, again, you have the beverage curve relationship and the significance goes away. So for the left-hand side, when we compare with our triple difference regressions, we see that it's very important to be using these county by time fixed effects. On the right-hand side, though, we see this spurious relationship where the minimum wage is increasing with total vacancies. This is just showing that there's a trend of minimum wage increases as well as total vacancies in other occupations. So now let's talk about robustness. We have a lot of robustness checks in the paper. I'm going to mention just 2 here. We looked at how robust is our results to our definition of at-risk group. And for that, we start with the baseline and then we remove one occupation at a time and repeat our triple difference regression. Basically, this is playing with the threshold of 5% that we've had in the beginning. And as you can see, although we take one occupation out at a time, our coefficient remains significant. You're seeing the 95% confidence intervals. Our results remain robust to changing the definition of at-risk groups. Another thing that we do is look at adjacent border county samples. So this is following a famous paper in the literature where they're arguing that it's better to compare results in adjacent counties who are at the state borders, because economic shocks that affect these counties will be similar while they're going to be subject to different policy changes. And when we apply their approach, we find that our estimates go through this robustness check and we continue to find the negative impact on vacancy creation. Okay, and then the last thing we do is now we're at the stage where we're going into more heterogeneity within occupations. So one thing that we were wondering was whether it's the routine occupations that are being more impacted. So in the first column, you're seeing our baseline results. In the second column, we are interacting minimum wage at-risk occupations with the routine. And as you can see, we do not find that routine occupations are being more impacted than non-routine occupations. And then the next thing we think is, of course, whether it matters, whether it's routine manual, non-routine manual, and then that's what we do in column 3. So in comparison to the cognitive occupations, we find that manual occupations have been impacted more. Vacancy creation declines in manual occupations, which is different from previous results in this literature where they were arguing minimum wage increases lead to higher automation and decline in employment in routine occupations. Here, the difference is we're looking at vacancies, and we're finding that manual jobs have been impacted more. And similar results follow up in new vacancies. So that's one heterogeneity that we have explored so far. I don't have it here, but we've also looked at heterogeneity across education levels. And we do find that low education is important. Vacancies where the workers are mostly low educated are being impacted more. And then final heterogeneity that we're going to consider is poverty. And then that wraps up my presentation. So in conclusion, we looked at the effects of minimum wage increases on vacancy posting for at-risk occupations. This is, to our knowledge, the first paper that considers vacancy posting. Again, literature has looked at mostly the employment effects. Our data set allowed for granular local controls, yet we found significant and negative effects on vacancy posting of minimum wage increases. And we found that these negative effects are front-loaded and more concentrated in manual occupations. Thank you very much. I'd be very happy to have your questions.
Great, thank you, Didem. And for those in the audience, we're going to have one more paper presented, and then we'll ask. We'll just talk. The authors will talk amongst themselves. I may have a few questions here and there, but then we'll open it up to questions. So feel free to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and so they'll be queued up where I'll be able to share them. Actually, to share them with our presenters. But it's another great presentation, and yeah, very clear and yeah, interesting results. And I look forward to a conversation. Dillan.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, great, thanks. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for sticking around in this session. My name is Dillan Bono-Lunn. This paper is co-authored by Dr. Jeremy Moulton at UNC and Dr. John Scott at Pew Charitable Trusts. Jeremy is on the call today. We're looking at the relationship between minimum wage and self-employment within occupations. And just to preview our results, we find that an increase in the minimum wage is associated with a decrease in the share of unincorporated self-employment, specifically within low-wage occupations with highly flexible schedules. And I'll get into what that means in a little bit. Our results vary by gender, age, and educational attainment. Where the magnitude of the effect we find is larger for men than for women, larger for older than for younger workers, and then larger for workers with some college or a college degree versus those on either end of the education distribution. The policy salience of this relationship between minimum wage and self-employment depends on whether self-employment is good or bad for the worker. While self-employment can confer higher wages and greater control over timing and location of work, it's also associated with a lack of health and retirement benefits, as well as greater earnings volatility. Of course, as with other forms of non-standard work, measurement of self-employment presents some challenges, with some work likely not being captured by surveys. The ambiguity in job quality in self-employment may be due to the contradictory drivers of an individual's entrance into self-employment. There's a large literature around the push and pull factors for self-employment. The minimum wage may be one policy determinant of self-employment among others like tax incentives or health insurance. And though there's a great deal of evidence around the employment effects of minimum wage, as my co-panelists have mentioned, there's very little existing evidence on the effect of the minimum wage on self-employment specifically. Our question of how minimum wage affects the composition of the workforce is related to others' work around the heterogeneous treatment effects of the minimum wage. So for example, there's evidence of the minimum wage inducing labor substitutions across demographic groups and skill level. And so our question is essentially around, what about substituting independent contractors for employees? Blau first studied the minimum relationship between self-employment and the minimum wage, where the minimum wage was a proxy for wage rigidity. Expecting a positive relationship, Blau actually found that the real minimum wage had mixed effects on self-employment. 2 out of the 3 coefficient estimates were negative. He concluded that the minimum wage variable was a relatively crude proxy for wage rigidity. There's been little follow-up research from Blau, though there is some literature in developing countries that minimum wage legislation is associated with an increase in formal employment. And one paper using Canadian data has found a positive relationship between the minimum wage and self-employment. Self-employment can be viewed as a substitute for hired employment for both employees and employers. And because of this, an a priori prediction of the effect of the minimum wage and when minimum wage increase on self-employment is ambiguous. A minimum wage can increase operating costs, and employers may cut back on wage workers and rely on self-employed contractors, thereby increasing the demand for self-employed workers. However, self-employed workers observing higher wages in traditional employment may apply for hired work, thereby reducing the supply of self-employed workers. So this leads us to our research question, which in this paper we're asking, what is the effect of a state minimum wage increase on the rate of self-employment? We're looking at both unincorporated and incorporated self-employment, and we're looking at this within occupations. We also ask whether this effect varies by occupational wage quartile, by scheduling flexibility of the occupation, or by demographic characteristics such as gender, age, and educational attainment. We theorize that individuals weigh the relative gains of self-employment and hired employment against the relative risk of self-employment and their own risk aversion. Self-employment inherently carries different risks than hired employment due to volatility of earnings and lack of benefits. However, self-employment can also confer higher earnings relative to hired employment, as well as greater flexibility and control over work. A minimum wage increase represents a shift in the relative earnings of self-employment versus hired employment, where upon a minimum wage increase, workers may be able to expect a higher wage equal to or greater than the wage that they'd expect from self-employment. So thus, we expect to see that workers previously classified as self-employment under a lower minimum wage, where the expected wage from hired employment is lower than that of self-employment, they may be induced into hired employment following a minimum wage increase. If this relationship exists, we should observe it in occupations in which workers have greater control over their work hours or scheduling flexibility. We're theorizing that workers in occupations with greater scheduling flexibility are more likely to have a preference for greater control over their work schedules, and therefore are more likely to view self-employment as a substitute for hired employment. So therefore, we expect to see that increases in the state minimum wage are associated with a decline in self-employment within flexible occupations, occupations with high rates of scheduling flexibility. And this shift in relative earnings is more likely for workers in occupations that pay lower wages than those that pay higher wages. And therefore, we also expect to see that increases in the state minimum wage are associated with a decline with a decline in self-employment within flexible occupations, particularly for workers in occupations that pay lower wages. It's relatively easier to move from hired employment to unincorporated self-employment, and lower skilled workers are more likely to be unincorporated than incorporated. And so we also hypothesize that the relationship between minimum wage and self-employment that we're expecting to see in our first two hypotheses is stronger for unincorporated self-employment versus incorporated self-employment. In order to understand the effect of a state minimum wage increase on self-employment, we employ a series of difference in difference designs, starting first with the difference in difference, stratified by the degree to which an occupation's working hours are flexible and by the occupation's median wage. We then estimate two sets of triple differences stratified by flexibility and wage, and then finally come to a quadruple difference that incorporates all of these stratifications within one estimating equation, thereby allowing us to test the effect sizes observed in the different stratifications, just to make sure that they're statistically different. So this slide represents the equation for our quadruple difference, where the logged minimum wage quartile of an occupation, and scheduling flexibility of the occupation are our treatment variables of interest. And I should note that, that we're using a state fixed effect in all of these difference in difference models. And so that state fixed effect represents the fourth difference in this equation here. Each model includes a vector for education, age, and gender, as well as a state fixed effect, year fixed effect, and state by year linear trends. And we cluster our standard errors at the state level. We're using American Community Survey, or ACS, data from 2000 to 2017 for this design. And we're using ACS data so that we could have larger within occupation sample sizes. Our overall sample size is 19.5 million individuals. And we use class worker to identify self-employment status. So again, we're looking at both self-employment generally, and then looking at incorporated versus unincorporated self-employment as well. We match these data with David Newmark's state minimum wage data from the same years, as well as the current population survey's work schedule supplement. We use WS Flex Hours, which reports whether a respondent has the ability to vary when they begin and end their workday, and calculate a rate of scheduling flexibility within an occupation. If an occupation's rate of scheduling flexibility is greater than the median, around 30%, then we considered that occupation highly flexible. We constructed wage quartile from the ACS data using years 2001 to 2007, with 2007 as the base year. The wage quartiles are specified on the screen. So now we come to our results. So we run a difference in difference model first, regressing self-employment on logged minimum wage across the entire sample. Then we stratified by wage quartile and by scheduling flexibility of occupation, so high versus low. There's very few significant results on this table, although a 1% increase in state minimum wage is associated with a 0.006 percentage point decrease in the probability a worker in the second wage quartile will be self-employed. So then we start cutting the data differently and look at a triple difference estimation for the whole sample, then also stratifying by wage quartile. There is an association between the flexibility of an occupation and the likelihood that a worker within that occupation is self-employed, as evidenced by a positive statistically significant coefficient for flexible across all of these regressions. So that gives us some confidence around using this flexibility variable. The minimum wage is associated with a higher probability of self-employment, both at the lowest and highest wage quartiles among non-flexible occupations. However, the coefficient on the interaction between minimum wage and flexibility is negative and statistically significant across all wage quartiles, providing some further evidence to support hypothesis 1, that increases in the state minimum wage are associated with a decline in self-employment within flexible occupations. As predicted in hypothesis 2, the coefficient for that first wage quartile in regression 4 is substantially larger in magnitude than the other quartiles, and suggests that a 1% increase in a state minimum wage is associated with a 0.095 percentage point decrease in the likelihood a worker in a flexible occupation is self-employed. We also looked at self-employment, sort of splitting those out into unincorporated and incorporated self-employment. So this is the same estimation from the previous slide, but now we're looking at those two different types of self-employment. The coefficients for the interaction term appear to be largely driven by unincorporated self-employment versus incorporated, for which statistically significant results are only present at those higher wage quartiles and at much smaller magnitudes. So this supports hypothesis 3, that the relationship between minimum wage and self-employment is stronger for unincorporated versus incorporated self-employment. And so we have one final triple difference stratified by flexibility before we get into our quadruple difference. So the interaction term is now between wage quartile and log to minimum wage, and regressions are presented for all occupations as well as stratified across flexibility of occupation. The coefficient on the interaction between first wage quartile and log to minimum wage among workers in highly flexible occupations is negative for unincorporated self-employment and positive for incorporated self-employment, suggesting there are different forces driving workers into these two subtypes. It's worth noting here that our omitted category for these indicators is the fourth wage quartile, and thus all of our interpretations are relative to that omitted category. So for example, a 1% increase in the minimum wage is associated with a 0.0711 percentage point decrease in the probability that a worker in a flexible occupation in the first wage quartile is unincorporated self-employed relative to the fourth wage quartile. So finally, we're going to move to quadruple difference, and then we'll also show some heterogeneous treatment effects within that quadruple difference and difference estimation. So here we're performing a quadruple difference where the interaction is between wage quartile, logged minimum wage, and flexibility of the occupation. While the interaction between the first quartile, high flexibility, and logged minimum wage is negative and statistically significant for self-employment in general, this estimate is driven by unincorporated self-employment. So a 1% increase in the minimum wage is associated with a 0.071 percentage point decrease in the probability that a worker earning a wage within the first wage quartile and working in a highly flexible occupation is unincorporated self-employed. Conversely, the coefficient interaction between the third wage quartile, high flexibility, and logged minimum wage is positive, though substantially smaller in magnitude and statistically significant for both types of self-employment, unincorporated and incorporated. And so now we want to look at whether these results vary across gender, age, and educational attainment. So first, we'll look at gender. So while both men and women working in flexible occupations in that first wage quartile are less likely to be self-employed following a state minimum wage increase relative to workers in occupations in that fourth wage quartile. Remember that caveat to our interpretation. The magnitude of the coefficient for women is just over half the magnitude for men. That being said, women are less likely to be self-employed in general, and so that might have something to do with the effect that we see here. Looking at heterogeneous treatment effects by age, the relationship between the minimum wage and self-employment among flexible first quartile occupations remains statistically significantly negative across all but one age group, so 16 to 25 years. And we can see that the magnitude of that coefficient on this interaction generally increases with older ages, peaking for workers aged 46 to 55. Finally, for educational attainment, the relationship between minimum wage and self-employment among flexible first wage quartile occupations is statistically significant for workers with a high school diploma or more education, and the magnitude of that coefficient on this interaction generally increases with educational attainment, peaking with those with a college degree. And so just in summary, because I know we've thrown a lot of tables at you, our findings with associated tables are as follows. So an increase in the state minimum wage is associated with a decrease in an individual's probability of being self-employed among flexible occupations. This relationship was more consistent across wage quartiles for unincorporated self-employment versus incorporated. An increase in the state minimum wage is associated with a decrease in an individual's probability of being unincorporated self-employed for individuals working in lower wage occupations. And this again is occupations with median wages between $6.37 to $10.98 an hour. Combining these first two findings, an increase in the state minimum wage is associated with a decrease in an individual's probability of being unincorporated self-employed for workers in low-wage occupations with flexible work schedules. There's clearly some heterogeneous treatment effects for the result we observe in Table 5, where the magnitude of this effect is larger for men than for women, for older workers than younger workers, and for those with some college and a college degree versus those with less education or greater education than college level. And the differential effects depending on wage quartile and demographics really warrant some further investigation into what's going on behind these numbers. And additionally, we've presented a theory around risk of self-employment and the extent to which minimum wage can alter trade-offs between earnings and risk. And we've shown some analysis using public survey data to support that. However, further research into how individuals make these choices should be conducted and should consider other constraints like health insurance access, household composition, and tightness of the labor market, which we saw in Ben's paper today, some nice ways of considering that. So, so that's what we're looking forward to doing in the next iteration of this particular project. Thanks so much for y'all's time, and looking forward to any questions or comments.
Great, Dylan. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very well presented. Able to, yeah, as you said, do a lot of information at us, but I think you pulled it together from the beginning through your narrative and through the end. So what I'd like to do now is let's have some conversation kind of amongst the authors. 20 minutes or so, we'll see how it goes, but then we'll shift over to the audience. We have plenty of time for discussion amongst ourselves, and also I think getting for you all to get some feedback from those in the audience. And I guess the first question I have, maybe to kick it off for you all, is I'm very sympathetic, and I think I mentioned in our opening remarks, I applaud that you all are looking at other outcomes, that you're looking at trying to tell a richer story around the impacts that minimum wage increases can have right on the economy. Yeah, and I've done some work on where I've looked at food security and how did modest increase in minimum wage affect food security. But in that work, I still always people ask me, so you're using a different data set, you're using different time periods, right? What are your employment effects? And it seems like, in y'all's work, it would be very important, right? To to be able to tell us what with your data sets, with your approaches, what kind of employment effect do you have, and is that employment effect consistent, right, with then the findings that you get with the self-employment, and then the findings that you get with increased vacancies. So Ben, you want to start? Don't mean to put you on the spot. You were nodding your head.
Sure, I can jump in. I think there's definitely a component of the motivation for me jumping into this project was at University of Washington, we had the Seattle Minimum Wage Project, which was focused on unemployment insurance data. And so we had really rich individual level data and firm level data for those people working in formal, employed, non-exempt work. And we had this giant missing question, which was what happens to the exempt marketplace there? And we had no data to address it for UI. And one of the thoughts was, or at least when I kind of came in my first year as a PhD and started talking with people who'd been working on the data substantially more than me, my first thought was what happens to independent contractors or gig workers? And do people maybe substitute some of the work there from that negative effect we identified in the first paper in the project? And we had no way of answering it. And so I started looking at the literature about CPS data, ACS data, other types of ways of addressing and measuring effects. And it seems like there was this really big line of either people include it because they have it and they don't differentiate between exempt and non-exempt work, or they just don't have the data, so we just ignore it. And I started looking at other aspects of minimum wage literature, and it felt like there were other things beyond just that aggregate welfare employment effect that we just kind of ignored in the literature. So I thought it's just really great to see other papers that kind of address these other ways minimum wages might interact on the labor market. And for me personally, I thought that this was a really important one given the kind of growth and attention to non-standard or alternative work arrangements that are exempted from the minimum wage. So that was kind of where I came from with this. But overall, it's difficult to kind of address what are the important things to add to the literature at any given moment, and how do we kind of prioritize one data set or one source of that variation versus another. I don't know how other people feel.
Yeah, but I guess my question is one of, if you were to take your right-hand side variables, your time period, and instead of putting in your measure of self-employment, but you put in some measure of unemployment or employment, right, and estimate the models, right? Do you get job loss, which then could be your link to your results could then be interpreted as those are people who are leaving the exempt sector and going into gig work or going into
I suppose I should be more explicit about the idea. When we think about my results, I think what it's saying is that when we look at data sources that don't include exempt work, we're more likely to see a negative effect for the minimum wage that is actually masking the fact of transition between types of work potentially. So seeing a negative effect on hours might actually be people switching from 1 hour in the non-exempt marketplace to an hour worked in the exempt marketplace. So it might be overestimating the negative effects of minimum wages on those analyses, as opposed to survey data that might not be differentiating between self-employed types of employment versus non-self-employed, and then it might look more like a null effect from the minimum wage. So I think there's absolutely a space to say that my results point towards maybe an overestimate of negative effects that fail or are unable to measure the exempt marketplace.
Okay, great, thank you. Didem?
Well, so what we are focusing on is a little different, right? So a lot of the papers have looked at the employment effects. We wanted to take a little more direct approach and understand what can be happening with the vacancies. And the way, we are thinking about this is when we use our strategy and look at different data sets on employment effects during that period, we don't really see big impacts. So we are thinking about our results in line with the previous studies that did not find big employment effects. Just because vacancies are declining does not necessarily mean separations are increasing, right? So it's really consistent with some of the studies that came before us that looked at employment. But at the vacancy point, we are trying to bring a new perspective. So why would employment not increase? How are vacancies increasing? What's happening to separations? So it would be very nice if we have other work that looks at separations, and then we can combine all these and tell a more consistent story about the impact of minimum wages.
Great, thank you. Dillan?
Yeah, so similar to Didem, I think we were taking a slightly different perspective on things, that employment is sort of this combination between employers and employees. And so we were asking ourselves, well, what are sort of the behavioral effects of a minimum wage increase? How do employers behave differently, or how do employees behave differently? And we actually came into the project thinking more about, well, how do employers respond to the minimum wage? And there's a lot of really interesting work even being presented at ASSA around how firms respond to minimum wage increases and to other policies in a labor market. And so we were really focused on these sort of behavioral effects. And we're sort of jumping off from work by a colleague, which I think Jeremy could probably summarize better than I could.
Sure. Yeah. So I think your question is really important. One thing to focus on in our paper is that we are looking at conditional on working. Are you self-employed or are you in the traditional? So it's a different question than I think what you're asking, which is a really important question. One of my former students, Paul Tracy, he wrote his job market paper, I think, or one of his dissertation chapters, I'm looking at it right now, was looking at not are you employed or not, but just are you in the labor force when the minimum wage changes. And he found some really cool, interesting results where he found that for younger people, they actually left the labor market. They said, I'm not even in labor force. Older people hopped in the labor force, which is interesting to sort of, that was one of the main results that he found, was sort of this heterogeneity and just people's decisions to say, hey, I'm even looking for a job based on what the minimum wage was. And then he also broke it out by a bunch of other things, gender, education, things like that. That was, like, I've written some work on self-employment in the past, and then I had this student who was working on minimum wage, and I said, hey, we should put these together. And a big question we had is, I initially thought, and Dillan thought, when the minimum wage jumps, people are going to say, hey, I can't pay you that, but you become a contractor and I'll just, you keep doing what you're doing, but now you're a contractor. That's not really what we found, which is a little bit surprising to us.
Right. And I guess my follow-up then is kind of a potential comparison between y'all's paper and Ben. Am I correct in interpreting that you're getting the opposite results or different results?
But we're looking at conditional on working, and he's actually looking at a very different question. So ours is just saying, for those who are working, what's the percent of people that are self-employed versus traditional work? Right.
Yeah, I think that the difference in sign is always just kind of like that immediate comparison between these papers. As I was listening to it, and as I said to Dillan before, when I first sat in on the talk at 8 p.m. a while back, my first gut felt like, oh no, contracting signs. But I think the big differences between the papers are that conditional unemployment is a huge factor. And also the difference in the data set being that survey data is prioritizing your primary source of income. Whereas the non-employer establishments is administrative, which is just, do you have income in self-employment? And I think that also opens up a space for comparison of maybe if we are saying, even if in aggregate, people treating primary sources of income of self-employment end up reducing or increasing, there's also space for what is happening in the secondary or that supplemental source of income, which is where a lot of independent contracting in the online gig economy is taking place, as a supplemental as opposed to primary.
I think it would be very cool to be able to merge. I know you can't merge these, but it'd be very cool to look at, primary and secondary employment and see how different these results are. I'm not sure if you can do that with your data, but I don't think so.
I can't do it with the publicly available one, but there is a few projects out there with the merged 1099 as well as W-2 income, and that's the data that you'd really need to be able to answer it, which I applied for a while ago, but knowing the census, and so realistically the census ended up delaying the application as soon as they had to do the 2020 census, and it's just been sitting in that gray space for a while.
I mean, I think there's this cool result with Didem's paper, which shows there's this big drop in like people looking to have people work for them, right? I mean, there's this huge drop in the number of jobs that are out there when minimum wage jumps. And so I think there's a lot of cool, interesting things that are happening all together with these three papers. So I think it's kind of nice to see them all together.
Exactly. So I have one other question, and just before I ask it, I do want to tell our folks that are in the audience, please, I know I've got one already queued up, but if you have questions, comments, reactions, please put them in the Q&A or the chat feature, and I'll pose them to the group. And my last question, then I'll let you all talk amongst yourselves or ask each other questions, is Didem showed a chart, like sort of frequency distribution of the sizes of minimum wage increases, and I've seen that before and made it, and also, and I came up with that exactly, like with the median increase about 10%. help me wrap my head around that, that for a 10% increase, we're seeing, right, these kind of behavioral shifts. Right? I don't have a benchmark to say, is 10% large or is it small, but I don't know, my priors lead me to, or want to think that, 10% isn't that big an increase. When we talk about in a policy sense, and when I've been on work for President Clinton and others, or been a part of these minimum wage campaigns, we one of the big things we say is, 10% is a modest increase. And so yet you're getting, right, sizable, right, shifts in self-employment. Are you, is it something about your estimator that the variation that you're capturing is you're building these estimates off of, right, larger increases, or is it that in your data set, Ben and Dillan, that your actual average increase, maybe it's larger than 10%? Does that make sense?
I mean, all I can say is 10% is not large. So I just want to remind you that the increase was from $5.15 in 2 years. It went up to $7.25. So 10% is quite small. And for our results, we find a 10% increase in the minimum wage is associated with 2.4% decline in vacancies. If you actually think about like a 30-40% increase in minimum wages, that would be pretty sizable decline in vacancies at the at-risk occupations. So that is definitely something that policymakers need to think about. And the next question is, why do we see this and what is it leading to? Then the next question is, when these vacancies at risk that are being impacted, is that because employment separations are declining, or is this going to have a more long-term impact on the employment? So those are the next questions to consider, but definitely 10% is not sizable based on what we have seen in the past as for the minimum wage increases.
Yeah, I'm looking at a few different states right now, their schedule of changes over time. And a lot of times, so for instance, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, a bunch of these states, and maybe it was they were changing with the federal, but they go up by 70 cents a year. So it's like there's 3 years in a row where you see about a 13-14% increase. And so sometimes they won't just phase these in all at once, which would be nice for methodologically. It would be able, let's have a $15 minimum wage and have like an $8 jump or something. That doesn't usually happen, I don't think.
Yeah.
But a lot of times it'll be a relatively large jump, but it might take a few years to phase in.
And I guess maybe the spirit of my question is, given these increases, and actually someone in the chat in the Q&A says regarding 10%, didn't one paper give a median increase of 7% in the minimum wage? And so I guess where I'm just brainstorming or just thinking out loud here is, right, these are small increases, yet you're finding, I think the first and third paper, Dillan, your paper, and Ben, your paper, you're finding sizable, right, changes, right, in self-employment, and so I guess that raises some questions of, what is it, something about your estimator, right, that's getting you the big pop, or is it maybe a billion to be quiet? Yeah, 10% is, even though it's small, people, these are people at the margin, right, that are that they're at the margins, they're low wage workers, and small changes have big effects. I don't know.
Yeah, I think when we're thinking about kind of the effect of a minimum wage change, even at 10% on employees and employers, we have to think about it not just as a 10% increase in one person's wage, but also from the employer standpoint of a 10% increase across a large number of employers can end up being a sizable effect for them. And we don't want to view low wage workers as really people who get to decide how many hours they work or their employment structure and situation at all times. I think the power aspect has something to do with it, as we've seen people say that I don't get to set my schedule. So maybe
William, for a second, about the 10% debate. I think one of the Q&A questions addressed this too. We did actually in our paper, during Didem's talk, we have a whole distribution of the actual nominal minimum wage changes, and the median is slightly more than 7% for each treatment, but there are really large ones as well. So 10% is not really off the mark quite a bit, but it's also sort of important to keep in mind that I think for all of the presentations today, we can say this, what we are finding is really local effects. So if you're thinking about increasing the minimum wage from $7 an hour to $15 an hour, well, that's not exactly going to be easily interpreted within these results, right? So, chances are if you have a really large change like that, in percentage terms, it might have, very different effects than what we find in our work in terms of local effects.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Murat. So we got a few more minutes. Let me, of you all, of us here, let me turn it over to you all. Do you have comments or things that you want to amplify, or sort of comments on other folks' work?
I really like Benjamin's data. I really like that data that you're working with. I think it's a cool use of trying to figure out the unincorporated numbers.
Yeah, the non-employer data, it's been interesting to work with, particularly because it hasn't been used a lot. I think because it's very specific in what questions you can ask for it, but I've found it to be very useful so far. Didem, I actually wanted to ask you about kind of the spillover aspect. So you're working with very local data on vacancies. So have you looked at spillover across either state lines or local county minimum wage changes for vacancies kind of across borders much, or?
So you mean when we see these at-risk occupations, the vacancies decline, do we see increases in other vacancies? No, that is a very good point. We have not looked at that yet, but that is something that that would be very interesting to look at, because we do have data on all occupations. We're not there yet, but that's a good suggestion.
I think your data is great too, Didem, that vacancy data. Like, I think this is so cool to look at both sides. I mean, you guys have some cool data. That's what's exciting to see here. But it's cool to see it from both sides, right? To see it from basically an employer side, and also to see it from the employee side, because there's a lot going on here.
Exactly. All right, so I have a question in the Q&A. Iona Marinescu, she says that in our work, we find that employment effects are most negative in low concentration markets. Is the increase in exempt work larger where the minimum wage effects on salaried employment are more negative?
Okay, so I think that was directed probably at my paper then.
Yeah. Yes.
So I can't say specifically that it's more, the effect is larger where salaried employment effects are more negative, since I don't have the salaried employment effects in my paper specifically, but from what I gather from the question is just in any of those low concentration marketplaces, and that is where I find my effect to be driven by. So I find that in low concentration marketplaces, large urban metros are predominantly it. That's where I see my positive effect on non-exempt work really being driven. So I would say yes is the answer to that question.
Great. All right, thank you. Another question, taking presentations 1 and 3 into account, can we then tell if an increase in the minimum wage or increase in minimum wages causes transition towards or away from jobs not covered by the minimum wage? So taking presentations 1 and 3 into account, can we then tell if an increase in the minimum wage causes transitions towards or away from jobs not covered by the minimum wage?
I almost feel like it's difficult to combine these two papers, and you know, the easy punt is going to say there needs to be more research, right? Yeah, but because really, I think that there could be a story where both of these papers represent one sliver of the truth. And because we're using different data, where Jeremy and John Scott and I are using what was someone's primary work activity versus Ben's looking at non-employer establishments, there might be something in there. And we also just don't know, like, are people being driven to take up or give up self-employed jobs like driving an Uber, and instead focus on their, you know, like minimum wage job, or vice versa. So yeah, I think it's I don't know, Ben, what do you think?
So I think from my paper, where the data is, it's really focused on counts of establishments, but I can't identify it at the individual level.
Yeah.
So it's hard for me to say convincingly or with certainty that one individual is to one non-employer establishment. So one potential explanation might be that people are taking up more non-employer establishments and we're seeing a compounding effect, or that a loss of one job in the non-exempt market might lead to more than one non-exempt job, or more than one exempt job, but just in very small amounts. But it's really hard to kind of combine the two papers, given that it's not only that mine captures non-primary, but also supplemental source of income, but it's not individually linked, and your paper is capturing individually linked primary sources of income. So I think while mine can show that there is an increase in the count of non-employers or the count of exempt work, it's hard to say that kind of our social conception of a job per person is really indicated in the same way across the two. So individually linked tax data is what we need. That's what I'm going to go with.
Well, and then from a policy perspective, you know, why this matters is, like, why are people being driven into or out of these like non-standard work arrangements, right? Like, I still don't think it's necessarily clear whether or not it's something we want, right? You know, this could be that people really value this, like, flexibility, and this is, you know, sort of like a drive in entrepreneurial spirit, or this could really be that people are struggling and so they're needing to supplement their hired income, right? And so I think that still is unclear.
I think there's one story that is consistent between the two, and that's the welfare effect. And that if you're showing that as minimum wages increase, people intentionally transition into a marketplace that has higher wages, that seems to me like welfare improving. And for mine, I'm demonstrating the fact that if we did a minimum wage analysis with no acknowledgement of exempt work, and we found a negative effect in low concentration areas without acknowledging exempt work as a transition area, would be overestimating negative impacts. So this transition would be minimizing, or at least reducing, a negative impact of the minimum wage, would be implying that welfare effects are more likely to be positive, or at least more positively skewed than we're revealing. So I think between the two papers, even if we can't say specifically that more jobs move one way or another, as we might classify it, we can say that welfare looks to at least be either underestimated or not accurately estimated when not including or adjusting for self-employment.
Right.
The other thing I'll highlight, sorry.
No, you go. Right.
I was gonna say our overall effect is actually quite small. It's when you start breaking it out by flexible, and then you're looking at, you know, so like our overall, even unincorporated, even if you're looking at just the first wage quartile, is close to zero. It's once you start looking at flexible work and once you start doing some other stuff that you see these sort of relative effects. And so it's conditional on working, right? So we're not going to be able to talk about, are there flows that are different to like more workers or less workers? You know, it's more conditional on working, what percent are self-employed versus not. And then also it's, you know, looking at these within that different kinds of occupations you see movement around. And so, yeah, anyway, sorry.
No, it's great. Yeah. And I think going forward, what you all have presented or put together for today is really, really helpful. However, it'd be, I think, really instructive to go down that path. That path of minimum wage goes up, right? We get vacancies, so that's the labor supply story, right? People are pulled into the market because the wage offer is now above the reservation wage. But but to piggyback on what you were saying, Ben, right, that if not only are you getting an insured wage as long as the employer, right, treats you for free work, you're also getting another set of rights, right, associated with that. But then you have this other piece now. There are people who are losing their jobs, and do they then, right, move over to the exempt sector, right, or they move over to self-employment? So in reality, they're not going to zero, right? But the challenge, and then raising the minimum wage, right, brings folks back, because they're attracted to because there's a higher wage, but also the feature of being in a more organized economy. But I think helping people really see those movements, that dynamics, that would be, I think, really helpful from a standpoint of whether you're trying to get Congress to move on increases, or you're helping to a conversation at state and local level. So.
And I think, kind of piggybacking off of that point, if I was really going to try and resolve our papers between paper 1 and 3, I would highlight the fact that we don't even need to see full employment loss to see a negative effect of minimum wage. We can just see hours reductions, and that would almost certainly exist in the space not affecting primary self-employment. If someone loses 2 hours at a coffee shop, they're not going to start a 40-hour-a-week self-employed business. They might take up 2 hours of driving for Uber and Lyft instead. Mm-hmm. And so thinking about the way that there's space in between just job loss or not in minimum wage literature and those other kind of zones of vacancies where we're seeing effects of minimum wage are just as important to kind of really pursue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm looking at there, and it looks like you all had individually answered them, but for the benefit, I think everybody sees the Q&A. But just to bring this out, so we do have a little bit more time. On the second paper on the vacancy paper, Didem, if the minimum wage decreases quits, then this could contribute to decreasing vacancies. Is there any way to account for this empirically?
No, that is a very good question. With our data, we cannot see quits at the very detailed occupational level, but that's something that I was trying to mention. If it is coming through the decline in separations, and then we don't need to be worrying that much if it's within the same occupations. So what we try to do, we try to look at the employment at the county level with the different data sources. So we were not finding big employment effects. So that's definitely something we're gonna keep investigating. But we do not have the same level of occupation at the county level to look at the employment effect. So it's a little different looking at different data sets. But I can just say, based on what we've try to play around with, we don't see big employment effects. So hopefully some of the decline we see is related to better matches and lower separations.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. And another one was, do these results mean that there is no strong oligopoly effects in those at-risk occupations?
Right, yeah, Murat wrote an answer to that. We don't have such structure in our data again, not necessarily.
Yeah. Right. You got a shout out from an anonymous attendee. Interesting paper. I'm just wondering, that's the nice stroke before the PAM. I'm just wondering if you investigated longer term relationship between vacancy and minimum wage. Is it just only occurred in the first 1 or 2 years, or more persistent effect?
Yeah, so Murat wrote a really long answer to that. I'm gonna let Murat take over this. Murat, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, the issue is, in principle we can, but I counted a couple of reasons why we didn't think it was a good idea to begin with. One is going beyond four to 6 quarters is actually really going to confound several different minimum wage treatment effects, because most of the states would have very frequent minimum wage increases. So you're not going to be able to identify one particular treatment or minimum wage change, right? It would be cumulative effects over many different policies sometimes. I mean, depending on the long run that the anonymous have in mind. The second one is over longer horizons. I said, I mean, there might be other labor market policy changes, right? So I mean, things come to mind about like ban the bucks stuff, for instance, maybe other UI related policy changes as we had during the Great Recession or right now. So these are all, in a different paper I have using the same data, for instance, we showed that employer credit checks had a negative effect banning the employer credit checks had a negative effect on vacancies. So other policy changes are also happening at the same time, so on different horizons. So you might, it would be hard to identify the causal effect of the minimum wage increase then. And in some sense, also theoretically, we think of vacancies as a jump variable, so it's not a stock variable, right? So you think, and it's very forward-looking. So if there's any effect, you would expect that to happen sort of very early on and quickly. This variable would adjust relatively fast relative to, say, employment stock or other stuff, right? So it really doesn't make sense in that sense to look at longer horizons necessarily. Or at least you can focus on that, but not finding any significant results or in one direction or another doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have any causal impact, because we expect that this is going to happen in a narrow window. And in some sense, finally, I think this is actually at the heart of our paper in some sense. Vacancies, we think, is really unique variable and a sort of a good contribution to this literature, partly because minimum wage literature early on, in early incarnations of that sort of long line of research, have always focused on employment, but employers have many different margins to adjust to this shock, right? So the hours margin, intensive margin, households respond differently, as we have seen from the other two papers, by changing their employment status between self-employment and not. So vacancies, we think, is a different margin, and I have linked, another question earlier with a paper on the employment turnover. So these are all gonna interact, and what this means is over longer horizon, employers would have many different dimensions in which they can adjust to minimum wage increases, and in some sense that would sort of like diminish the identification power of one individual change on a particular margin. So that's part of the reason why we would and plus Isaac Sorkin has really a recent and nice paper on identifying the long run effects, and there are other theoretical reasons why you might want to sort of stay away from this anyway, from that longer perspective. I mean, that was sort of my long answer. Sorry to keep you too long, but
not a problem. So I just put a call out to the group for sort of a last call on questions. Why don't we maybe do a kind of a round robin or a lightning round here? We'll start with Dillan. Maybe you can just sum up or tell us about what your next steps are, or to Jeremy and others what you guys are doing. Or
sure. So certainly our next step is sort of similar to what Ben showed in his presentation, is thinking about the local labor market. So something like a tight versus slack labor market, thinking about essentially what is the sort of like supply of labor market opportunities. And then I didn't have a question per se for Ben, but I had a comment around how I was just thinking about how this is going to be more and more important, just given Prop 22, that Uber and Lyft and other sort of like online gig, they're not employers, gig like companies are actively having a hand in some of these policy discussions. And in fact, this isn't too different from different industries having a say about who was exempt or not exempt from a minimum wage when the minimum wage was first established, but it will be interesting going forward. I was thinking about how you were talking about the fight for 15, equally that Uber and Lyft and these companies have this very big voice in policy around non-standard work arrangements, and that's only going to increase going forward. Uber and Lyft have already said that they want to sort of be on the national stage in terms of following on from their work on Prop 22. So that'll be a really interesting space in the coming years.
Great, thank you. Jeremy, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think we've got a couple more robustness checks to do for that paper, but I think we're going to try to push that one out pretty quick and continue working on this stuff. But I think I've really enjoyed these two other papers, and so I think it's been a really good session.
Yeah.
Great, agree. Didem.
Well, first of all, really nice papers. Thank you so much for the questions and suggestions. We're going to keep playing around with our data a little bit more because we have a lot more heterogeneity that we can explore. As I tried to mention at the end of my talk, we can look at different poverty level, how workers are being impacted by these vacancy declines. We have data on education levels of workers in these different vacancies. There's still a little more heterogeneity that we can dig into. And then, Ben, your suggestion was really nice. We should definitely think about the spillover effects. And then, as I said, we've been trying to look at overall employment effects, trying to reconcile that with our results. I think that's going to be another venue that we're going to keep digging into. Thank you so much, everyone. And maybe Murat has more to add. This is what I have in mind as our to-do list, but this was really helpful for us. Thank you so much.
Murat, did you want to chime in?
Sorry, I didn't unmute on time. Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add to Didem, but I think there's issues about whether our results are consistent with the literature on employment effects is one thing we want to at least sort of explore and explain a little bit deeper in our paper. And I think our results are perfectly consistent with the sort of no significant negative effects as well, which would again also be very consistent with Iona's earlier question about the turnover. And we know from existing work that in response to minimum wage, actually employment flows decline as well. So in some sense, turnover might decline, and vacancies is one way this manifests itself while keeping the employment. And we want to sort of explore that next to say a little bit deeper, I think.
Excellent, sounds good. And I think just, when your samples do permit on your heterogeneity, and this is for all the works when it's feasible, is inject race and ethnicity. To get those comparisons, because we do know those are very different. Can be in certain places, can be the labor market experiences, economic experiences are quite different. And actually, there's my colleagues at EPI and other places, right, have done that work and have shown, right, that when you have an increased minimum wage, it has a greater and more positive effect on certain groups, men and women of color. So, Ben, you get the last word.
Well, I'm actually really glad that you just brought that point up, because what I was going to say, kind of the next extension for this work, for me, while the minimum stuff for this paper, there's still some robustness stuff, is for me really focusing on other aspects of the exempt market and how it's not just historically been related to self-employment, but also based off of service sectors. And as we saw with recent work regarding the Fair Labor Standards Act reform, that exempt work and people kept out of labor force protections are not just about the type of job, it's also been systematically racist and biased, both by gender and race. And so thinking about the ways that kind of all of our papers think about how policy impacts the labor market needs those elements as well. So I think for my paper and for my dissertation as well, a focus that really needs to be continued to grow in it is, how does this work translate also to lived experiences of people working in these jobs? Not just of, do I participate, but what does it mean to participate?
Great, thank you so much. And Didem, thank you. Dillan, thank you. Jeremy, thank you. Murat, thank you. And please also thank your co-authors for their hard work, and congratulations on a really good set of papers. And this is, I still have not gotten comfortable with ending Zoom calls.
Well, thank you, Bill, for chairing.
Thank you so much.
Not
A great
problem.
session.
All right, take care. Happy New
Thanks.
Year, everybody.
Nice to meet everyone.
Bye.
Yeah, see you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.